Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to see you all here. Today's session, we're going to focus on our exclusive International Women's Day event, which is being hosted by Women in Planning and supported by the TCPA. And the topic of today's event is on Choose to Challenge and how we plan for inclusivity. I'm your chair for today's session. My name is Zoe Green. I'm an assistant director in the Cities and Sustainability team at PwC. I specialise in place-based growth, urban planning and spatial analytics, and have worked across around 15 countries. I'm really excited to be chairing today's session because, as many of you will know, the theme of this year's event is Choose to Challenge. And the lens that we will be putting on this event will be around inclusivity. The idea around the Choose to Challenge hashtag, which I hope you're all engaging with, and if not, I encourage you on Instagram and various other social media channels, is that we live in a challenged world and we need to make sure that we're more alert to some of these issues, particularly around gender inclusivity. We're emerging from the dark cloud of COVID, which has worsened gender equality. Recent research undertaken by the World Economic Forum has highlighted that economic disruption from the coronavirus outbreak has disproportionately burdened women with unpaid childcare, along with another number of other issues. It's really critical that policymakers must act now to close the gender gap. Otherwise, if this isn't left unchecked, the situation could negatively impact global GDP growth. And as individuals, we are all responsible for our thoughts and actions, however big or small they may seem. We can call out gender bias and inequality, or actively seek out to celebrate women's achievements. So through this, we can collectively create a more inclusive world. An inclusive world and place is particularly what we would like to concentrate on this session. So the way the session is going to work is that we're really delighted to have Inés S Madariaga join us to give a really informative presentation on the topic. Inés is a professor of urban planning at the Universidad Politécnica de Madrid. She's UNESCO Global UNESCO Chair on Gender Equality Policies in Science, Technology and Innovation. She's a professor of urban planning at Madrid, and she's a leading international expert on gender and city planning, architecture and STEM, with extensive experience in both public policy and research. She also holds a number of very high-profile positions, including as Executive Director of UN Habitat amongst these, and you can find out more about her on our website link. So we will be hearing in a minute from Inés on the key issues that she'd like to highlight around inclusivity and planning. The key questions that we're keen to explore in this session are really, how do we ensure we plan for a wide range of people? How can we reclaim those spaces that have been built and designed without inclusivity in mind? After the presentation, we'll be joined by a prestigious panel of experts, including Fiona Howie, CEO of TCPA, Marion Roberts, Professor of Urban Design at University of Westminster, and also Dr. Sule Nissan-Sioglu, who's an experienced urban planner, women in planning advocate, and occasional documentary filmmaker. So we've got a very exciting panel, and I hope you will engage with that. A few housekeeping rules. The session is being recorded and will be released, so you can also view this later on. I would encourage you to put questions in the chat box, and we will pick these up at the end of the session once we've had the presentation and obviously heard from the panel. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Inés to commence her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really my pleasure to be here and be able to share with you some of the work that we are doing to work on more inclusive cities and neighborhoods. let me first share my screen. I hope you can see it. Okay. Let me see. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Okay. If you put to present mode, yeah, we can see that clearly.
It's better like this. Okay, thank you so much. It's really my pleasure to be here and to share with you some of our experiences in Spain and in the UNESCO chair that we work at the School of Architecture in Madrid. These are the kind of activities that we do in the fields that you can do in the right side, all fields related to the construction of built environments. When we look at gender in cities, we have had for these past few years a framework of international agreements that set like a reference for gender equality in the city, and not only the city, also in territories and in all kinds of human settlements. And this objective of gender equality, SDG 5, and particularly with SDG 11, is to be put in place through this strategy that has been agreed on at the UN and also at the European level through the Treaty of Amsterdam, which is called gender mainstreaming, which is a tool to integrate gender dimensions into any field of policy, particularly in this case, planning policy. Because we have a field of action that has certain specificities and how to translate gender mainstreaming concepts and methods that have been designed for other areas of policy making, and to translate them into our field of planning involves certain specificities and difficulties, because some of these concepts relate very directly, some others not so much. And we are doing these efforts in this past, I would say, maybe 15 years to translate and to implement and to translate what are ideas that are quite clear about how equality is promoted through the built environment, through how a built environment that is more responsive to daily needs and to the specific realities of women and those who take care of others and care tasks, and how this translates into technical documents, because planning is a highly technical field of endeavor. This is like the leap that we are trying to do and that we are working on, and that we have been working on and we're working on in these past years. So we have first thing that we need to see is what are the main concepts that come from gender studies that are relevant to cities and to planning. And I would say that the main concept is the concept of care, which is very related to the idea of daily life that was developed originally in the 1960s by Henri Lefebvre, the French philosopher, who didn't talk about gender certainly, but our Scandinavian colleagues from the 70s started to transform this concept of daily life to read it from the perspective of women's needs and women's realities. And so the concept of care, defined as the paid and mostly unpaid work performed by adult individuals on behalf of children, the old, the sick, and the overall functioning of the household, is, I would say, the key concept that is relevant for inclusive cities from a gender point of view. And in addition to this key concept, there are other ones that are also relevant to understand how gender stereotypes and social norms affect the functioning of planning systems and planning cultures. Gender roles, obviously, which is highly related to the idea of care, as well as sexual divisions of labor and the double workload and productive and reproductive spheres, all these concepts that are very much interlinked to the idea of care. And then there are others that are also quite important, which is the idea of safety related to gender violence as it applies to public spaces, which Marion Roberts has worked a lot on. And also the concept of universal design, because bodies and the strength and the size of bodies is quite different. So universal design as it intersects with gender is very important. Of course, then there are other intersections of gender. As we know, particularly with age, but also with immigration, with race, with religious and other cross-sectoral factors that have to be taken into account. But the core issue remains, I think, care, and how care, what it implies for the use of the city in terms of time, the time that persons use for care tasks, and what they imply for how we have to go to specific places to do certain things at certain times of the day. What are the possible means of transportation or not? And then it's impossible to juggle all these activities, which can make women's lives or the lives of those who have both responsibilities of care and employment. It can get so difficult that sometimes it's impossible maybe to accept a promotion or to work full-time, or even sometimes even to work when you have small kids or responsibility of a very elderly and sick parent. And then when we bring these ideas into an understanding of how planning work, we have that still very much the functioning of planning systems is very much at its root, it's very much the idea of the functionalist city as defined in the Athens Charter and functionalism. Of course, this has been very much criticized even since the 1960s. We know all of this. But still, the core planning techniques, zoning techniques, and other techniques, which vary slightly among countries, but the core of planning remains the same across countries, very much so. And there are underlying assumptions about how these techniques were devised originally, and even if they can be flexibilized or they can be used in more careful ways, they still are a reflection of the personal experience of the city of those who don't have care responsibilities. And paid employment is the main focus of this. Housing is seen as a place for leisure and not for its care implications, and transport is regarded as mainly as the means to link the spaces assigned to employment and how they relate to housing. So these unquestioned ideas are often unconscious of how gender roles and sexual divisions of labor are implicit in planning practices. And of course, we have now all this rich body of research that started in the late 70s with the work of Dolores Hayden, with the work of Marion Roberts in the 80s, and of so many others that provide this understanding of all these issues in different geographical areas, in the US, in the UK, in Scandinavia, in Germany, in Spain, in different urban realities too. But there are certain core ideas that are exactly the same independently or which country we are working on. So I wanted to present how many of these research has been translated into more practical tools that provide some overviews of how the concepts identified in the academic literature can be translated into practical practices of professionals and of institutions. And this morning we had this presentation of this new guide that we have just finished on how to integrate gender dimensions into planning, which uses has an important section of it on examples, on particular case studies. And there are several others. I mean, they're very well known, produced by the City of Vienna in 2013, and then some produced more looking at the developing world by the UN Habitat and by the World Bank. That have some overlap with what's the situation in Europe, but is mostly looking at other parts of the world. So when we look at planning tools, I think it's important to start thinking of what are the tools that can be used and what are the plans in which gender has to be mainstreamed. And I think plans, it's at all scales and all types. And we are starting to have experiences at all of these levels of planning. And the tools, which are not plans, but are tools for planning, that of which we also have now experiences in different countries. And of all these that I'm showing you now, we have some experiences, most of them we have some experiences in Spain that we have been working on at our UNESCO chair in Madrid. And I will show you some of these. I want to mention this brief list of the legislation that relates to gender and planning in Spain, both at national and regional level. In a country like Spain, in which we have a slightly different legal system than you have in the UK, because we are more into the Napoleonic administrative system in which all public policy is based on legislation. So for us, legislation is very important, also for you, but there are slight, probably we rely more on legislation than you do. You have some ways of doing policy that is less linked to what the legislation says. So for us, legislation provides a very important framework. And I have to say that in the last 15 years, we have been developing what is now a quite substantive legal framework that allows, and some of these are planning in Spain is mostly regional competence. It's not national. The legislation on planning is regional. Then the plan making is a local, except for regional plans, of course, but municipal planning is a local competence. So for us, the legislation at the regional level is very important. But at the national, equality legislation is also national. So what comes from the national has had also an important impact on regional, and this provides a very important framework for implementation. And I would say that since we had a couple of judicial decisions, I would say 3 years ago, applying this that cancelled some local plans because they didn't have a gender impact assessment, and this was written in some regional laws. There has been a point of change, a very strong point of change in Spain. And gender and planning has become a main topic in professional and institutional discussions on planning. So I would say that we have become, in a way, a hot topic, and there's a very strong interest across the country on how and what can be done and how can we do it. So also this is also a list of the topics in which gender should be introduced, which are sectoral topics of planning and of programs, plans and projects, and of which we also have some experience. And I would like to show you some of these examples. The first I want to mention are related to transportation and different levels of planning regarding transportation that built on a concept I developed some years ago, which is a concept mobility of care, which is featured in the book that Marion Roberts and I co-edited for Ashgate in 2013. Mobility of care, which is a concept that allows to quantify and make visible all the trips made for the purpose of taking care of others who cannot move autonomously in the city, and also for the upkeep of the home. So these trips in normal transportation service are hidden under other categories, and so they look like they are not important because they are divided in small categories and they don't have a name, and sometimes they are not even counted because trips of less than 1 kilometer or less than 15 minutes on foot are not counted by many transportation service because those services are designed to plan for infrastructure by engineers. So in many cases those trips are not considered. But when we look at those and we give them a name, we have found that they are a significant amount of all the travel done at in any urban metropolitan area particularly. So we have applied this concept in a number of studies in different cities in Madrid and for the Inter-American Development Bank and for UN Habitat in Nairobi. And particularly in the city of Irún, which is a city in northern Spain, we have done it in the framework of their plan for urban sustainable mobility. And we have also the work we have done for them has a number of dimensions. This study on the mobility of care, and then the plan, the contribution to the plan, and then some work on women in the transportation and logistics sector, which is a sector that has a lot of employment opportunities and a very low representation of women. So transportation is a very important, and I would say in some parts of the world, it's like a first thing to look at from a gender point of view. The study we did in the matatu, which are those small buses in Nairobi, the matatu system from gender dimensions showed very, very significant differences in the use of women and men of the only public transportation system that they have, which is this. So a second one that relates also to public space and also to transport is from the point of it's more a qualitative approach, and it focuses on safety issues and qualitative issues of space. And we use in this kind of studies a methodology that is a variant of that developed in Canada in the 1990s by the cities of Toronto and Montreal, the exploratory walks with women or exploratory audits, depending on how you want to call them. And we have done quite a few of these around in different cities in Spain. In each of the neighborhoods, the methodology identifies specific points or area of interest in this previous work that we do with the women who live in the neighborhood, and then we complement the work with the women in the neighborhood, assisted by us from a technical perspective, with work done by our students at the School of Architecture who do the mapping of the significant elements that identify the sources of spatial quality and safety in the particular area that is being analyzed. And in these studies, we also do a lot of dissemination and publication of the results and sharing with the women in the neighborhoods that participated in the workshops. In this process of devolution of the study that we have done. A third area in which we have been working recently and is also quite innovative work, I think, is the area of gender and housing that we have advised. We have done a pre-normative study for our national ministry on gender and housing with some recommendations for a new upcoming legislation, state-level legislation on housing that mostly affects subsidized housing. And then the one that I want to point out more, I want to point out these other two that we have done, other two studies that we have done for two regional governments, for the Basque government and for the Valencian government, particularly the one for the Basque government. It's a series of recommendations that and not recommendations that have been translated into legislation and integrated into the legislation that affects all housing, both new and old, both subsidized and market rate in the Basque country, with certain standards that have been designed thinking from the point of view of gender, that mostly respond to these issues that are listed there. Minimum size of bedrooms, minimum size of kitchens, relationship between kitchen and other living areas in the homes, minimum standards of how do you say, storage, and safety criteria for the design of common areas and for the versatility and of the design of the housing units. And we are now finishing up, and this, as I said, this is a regulation that has the value of law. It's compulsory, and as a whole, they are a significant improvement related to previous housing standards. And then for the region of Valencia, we are now working on recommendations. Those are recommendations, hence they are more detailed than the ones we did for the Basque government, because they are not legally binding, so they can go more into detail. They are not so much standards, legal standards, but recommendations, and they go into quite detail on how to design housing from a gender perspective. Another area in which we are now having quite a bit of work is transport infrastructure and high-speed stations and some segments of the railways as they approach urban areas or they go through small towns in more rural environments, how to introduce criteria in the design of the train stations. Some of those are quite big, like the station Atocha in San Sebastián in the north of Spain. Some others are, the main problems were how the rail line cuts through the environment, the surroundings of small towns in more rural areas, Yes, then now going into plans. In Spain, we have a regulation on gender impact assessment of urban plans that in certain regions is written into law and it's compulsory. And this was the piece of judiciary decisions I mentioned before addressed gender impact assessments as a legal document that in the regions that have legislated about it has to accompany all the planning documents, and a couple of plans were cancelled because they didn't integrate that gender impact assessment. So this was the point of change that happened 3 years ago, and since then we have produced or we have advised some municipalities for the drafting of these documents, and we have to devise the methodology on how what should be the content, how it should be addressed. Some of those were quite big, like the modification of the general plan of the city of Madrid for the Madrid Nuevo Norte, which is a very big urban redevelopment area to the north of the city, for which we also provide advice for the design, which is it's a urban renewal project of a former railways site, underused sites in the north around the Chamartín transportation train station in the north. And a similar project of at a smaller scale, also in Irún, via Irún, it's also the redevelopment of the rail yards around what was historically a main transportation hub in Spain, because it's the frontier with France. So this has been historically a main hub, and this is a project in process in which we are advising how to integrate gender dimensions into its design, as we did for the Madrid Nuevo Norte project. And then at a greater scale of regional planning, the Basque government has mainstreamed gender into it's called Directrices de Ordenación del Territorio. It's a regional plan of the Basque Country, which involves 3 capitals and then many smaller scale towns and villages and a very significant rural countryside. We did that work for them. On how to integrate gender into this plan. We are working advising the urban agenda of the region of Valencia, and we did for the region of Extremadura a technical annex to their law of urban and and regional planning, which was approved in 2011. And this is the first time that a regional law that integrates gender aspects does it in such a detailed way as a technical norms that are annexed to the law itself. And then now for the region of Castilla-La Mancha, which is this is Madrid, so it's around Madrid in the center of Spain. This is to the west of Spain. We are now drafting a manual on how to integrate gender into their own planning legislation. Finally, I think I have one couple of minutes more, I think. Do I have 2 more minutes? I think so. For the Inter-American Development Bank, we are starting now a project that addresses some very poor neighborhoods that are in the very adjacent to the historical center, and that are being affected by climate change and by the increasing water levels by the sea. So we are starting this project now. It's a very impoverished area, and we have to do first a gender assessment and then a gender action plan on how to address the investment programs that the Inter-American Development Bank is devising in this area together with the government of Paraguay. Let me see. Yes, I think that's now the last one. Another field of work that we field in which we work is on the situation of women in technical professions, and particularly in architecture. And in this sense, we have these 2 upcoming projects that are almost complete now. For the Professional Association of Spanish Architects, we have done a study on the situation of women in Spanish architecture that will be presented next week during March 8th events. And then we are also publishing a biography. I am publishing this. I wrote this some years ago, but this is a new edition with a new chapter of the biography of the first Spanish woman architect, who she got her architectural title in 1936. And then we do a number of dissemination. This is a very important part of getting gender into planning. It's to create knowledge, to share it, to exchange it, and conferences like the ones we did with Marion Roberts and Susan Buckingham during the Gender STE Cost program have been very important instruments, I think, for having the people to know each other, to exchange, for helping the new generations to get into the area, to also exchange our own experiences, to create networks and collaborations and publications. So conferences and seminars and trainings are very important things as part of integrating gender into planning, as networks are. The networks like the Gender ST network, but also some others. There's one new network that has just started by our German colleagues from Hanover and from Austria with Doris Damjanovic, a group on gender and climate just cities and urban regions, which started working yesterday precisely. And among our publications, I already mentioned this manual and the book that we did, that Marion and I did in 2013. And last year, under the pandemic, the book Engendering Cities came out as part of the result of the work. I think it was the last conference we did with the Gender STE, the Gender STE Calls to Action. And that's it. I just would like to invite any of you who would be interested within the framework of the Gender Equality Academy project. This is a European funded project to promote training and education on gender topics across different areas. And one of the areas that is being addressed is cities, transportation, and climate change. We are holding a summer course in May. It will be online, and we will soon launch the call for applications. There will be a number of possibilities, of course, for any of you who would like to register for it. And I think we're going to have Susan Buckingham being one of the trainers of the summer course. Thank you very much, and I hope we can we will be able to get some of you into our course in May.
Thank you very much, Inés. That was an incredibly insightful and very sort of practical presentation as well. You've covered a wide range of topics from housing to transport to public realm, and all the different scales of policy and interventions. Has been really, really interesting. I'd like to invite our panel to turn on their videos. I'll just give a quick intro about who we've got on our panel today. We're joined by Sule Nishanjolu, who is a town planner with a PhD in ecology and an MA in town planning. She has significant senior management experience in strategic planning and local planning, making over 27 years, including working as the head of sustainability in Enfield and as head of strategic planning and transport policy in Haringey Council. And as I said before, an occasional documentary filmmaker. She recently won a film award in Berlin in 2020. So some very on the ground practical experience from Sule. Fiona Howley, we're joined, who is the Town and Country Planning Association Chief Executive. She joined in February 2019 and is responsible for the day-to-day running management of the organisation. And previously she used to work for the Campaign for National Parks. So we're very excited to have Fiona with us here today. And then finally, Marion Roberts, who is Emeritus Professor of Urban Design at the University of Westminster. She's internationally recognised as a researcher in 2 specialisms with the field of urban design and planning, and has sort of specialised in gender and built environment through her PhD. So very excited to have all 3 of you on the panel today. I would like you, first of all, to kind of just reflect on some of the things that came out of Inés's presentation. I picked up one point which I'd like you to sort of just give some quick reflections on, and that was really around kind of gender and data bias. Inés was talking about the mobility of care, how sometimes statistics can actually hide, the important, if you disaggregate, you can actually understand the patterns of data a little bit more. And I think, often when we're looking at gender and inclusivity, having an accurate understanding of what the reality is incredibly important. So I wondered if each of you could just reflect, referring to your own practice around data and research, how digging into the data is really important to really understand some of the trends and how you've come across that. I'd like to start with Marion. If you can reflect on anything in relation to your research, that'd be fantastic.
Yes, I think this issue about data is really important. And in the groups that Inés and I were in, we talked also about gender budgeting, which I thought was a really interesting concept. And, I must say that Inés's talk, Spain is obviously the place to look at for gender advances in gendered planning. But it's where the money goes, I think, is an important issue to look at. And for that, you really need disaggregated data. And in the UK, we're very unlucky in that we don't have very good data sources at all on gender differences. I mean, others may correct me if I'm wrong, but certainly I've found that. And so the kind of judgments that are reached tend to be based on maybe personal perception rather than accurate data. And I felt very, in the European networks I was involved in, I felt very jealous of, say, our Austrian colleagues who have a lot of data collection, and they also do evaluation by data, actually collecting gender differentiated impacts. The only area in which we did really well, I thought, in the UK was in transport, and particularly Transport for London, where we have found quite good sources of data. But we do have a new organisation that's very good across the board in more generalised sense, the Women's Budget Group. And I'd really recommend looking at their work for generalised impacts of, say, austerity, etc., on women.
Thank you, Marion. That's really helpful. Sile, do you have any sort of practical experience from the projects that you've been involved in around sort of data and how we can kind of improve around this area?
Data, in a sense, sort of referring to some of the work we did in the planning department in Haringey in 1990s, obviously comes from working with local communities and trying to understand what they think that is working or isn't working for them in the city. That's one way of collecting data, but perhaps later on maybe we can talk about the Open Sesame project and how we actually work with the communities to bring that information together. But also data is used in local plan making, equality impact assessments. But I think I will agree with Marion that we don't collect enough data, or the data may be out there, but we don't pull it together enough to make sense of it. It is there perhaps, but it's not visible. And things like equality impact assessments, I think, sort of miss the point. And all this information that we have doesn't actually, is now on our desks for us to see and to analyze on.
Thank you. And Fiona, on the issue of data, and particularly with the recent issue of the London Plan and sort of that coming out into publication finally, do you think we'll be in a better position around sort of data in London and how we can kind of plan properly around some of these issues?
I think, well, just as a general comment probably about data, I think that point around actually lots of it exists. It's about actually trying to make sure we're using it for the plan making process. So, for example, we do quite a lot of work around reuniting planning and health. And, there is lots of information out there about health inequalities and, the challenges, the health issues in people's local communities, but that's actually not always then used by the planners or shared with the planners to inform local plan making policies. So I think that point around actually bringing it together, making it more accessible is really important. I think also the point around we will see trends from data, but then unpicking those with communities, because we're really conscious that action or indeed inaction can, of course, entrench existing inequalities and exacerbate them rather than tackle them if it's just continuing the trends that are shown. So I think data is a really important starting point. We do need to get better at collecting it, but it's also then unpicking it rather than necessarily just thinking, oh, that's what the trends show, that's what we need to plan to address, when if actually it's a really unhelpful trend, then we need to tackle that. I think in terms of whether we will get better at collecting data, I think it's talked about a lot. I think the need to collect better data. I know that MHCLG, Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, are very conscious of the need to do it, and of course it featured in some of the bits of the planning reform white paper, talking about the fact that actually making these data sets more readily available both for communities and planners is important as a starting point for plan making. So I hope both in London and actually the rest of the country, it might be heading in the right direction, but I think it's very much a starting point that needs proper analysis rather than a sort of assumption that it will fix everything.
Absolutely. Inés also mentioned the importance around sort of regenerating those spaces that may have not been built and designed with inclusivity in mind, sort of some of those redevelopments around kind of station yard areas. on a kind of a project level and sort of practical level, how can we look to repurpose those spaces, or when we're like designing new schemes, what can we do to really make sure that gender and mainstreaming this is really front and center and thought about right from the go, not an afterthought? What would you recommend around this? And Sule, I'd be keen to get your views around this.
Well, this is a highly context specific, because it will depend on what the specific situation. But there could be certain principles. And the first one I would say is, what are the implications of that space from the point of view of care activities that can be related to the use, whatever use that is, of the space, or what are the needs of the people who use this space according to their gender roles and the tasks they perform on a daily basis. So looking at the implications from care and the implications of the profiles of the users, whether the users are citizens or they are people who work there as employees, or just passers-by. It all depends on what kind of space we're talking about and who are what's the specific purpose that space has. And then a second aspect has to do with safety. With safety, particularly in train stations and around train stations. Safety is a very big issue. Train stations can be places quite unsafe, particularly many transportation hubs can be, and in many places there are also locations where some populations even live there, like marginal groups, homeless people live there, and so there are. You need to look at and then what's the quality of the spaces from a point of view of materiality, of lighting, etc. So I would say care and safety are like two lenses, and the users. What are the users, and what's the use of the space, and what are the implications of the combination of all these elements from a spatial perspective, and then how the design addresses, how you can address all of these needs from a point of view of the material configuration of space.
Thanks, that's really helpful.
It's highly context related.
Absolutely. And I think that's the thing with when you're looking at sites, it's all about looking into the context, the understanding of the surrounding area and how that knits together. Sule, do you have any sort of further reflections around sort of reclaiming spaces and you know how we can bring the community in? Could you talk a bit more about the Sesame project that you just mentioned? You're on mute.
Okay. The Open Sesame project was a project that I facilitated while working for Haringey Council in early 1990s. And it was a planning service initiative. We had a departmental women's group looking at women's needs and how the built environment, you know, the interaction between the two. You know, the usual suspects. We were talking about safety, access to childcare, access to affordable housing, public transport, importance of our local centers, and then looking for policy implications of those issues. But we also wanted to know what women in the community will say about those type of issues that we have been we were discussing in the office. And I was lucky. I was given the time and resources to actually go out and about, make connections with the women's groups in the borough, and have long chats with them. It was almost like a sort of a whole year of meetings and surveys and discussions. We visited GPs, we visited hairdressers, we were outside school gates, we were out in town centers doing surveys, you know, meetings with women's groups, etc. So it was very intense. And we had a very good response. There were a lot of enthusiasm. There were a lot of women coming forward with, you know, telling us what works or it doesn't work for them in the built environment. And from all these discussions, this Open Sesame project came up. And basically, women armed with baby buggies and wheelchairs were going to descend on town centers and inspect the shops in terms of accessibility and also in terms of the facilities there. Like Inés said, care issue was really a burning issue, and how care-related roles are being catered for in the built environment. Because Open Sesame, and it was the idea coming from the local women. The Open Sesame focused on women in their traditional roles, if you like, as it was accepted then. And we found through the surveys that women carried out in town centers, 3-4 town centers in Haringey. Yeah, I mean, those needs, even in our traditional roles, were not catered for. Cities were failing us, if you like. So things we found like, steps to shops, heavy doors, narrow aisles, toilets sometimes, if there are any, you have to climb up the stairs to get there, nappy changing facilities, etc. So it was quite common to these issues. In all town centers. And for the last survey, women wanted us to carry out, we actually asked men from the planning department to come out with baby buggies and wheelchairs to do the inspection. So that was quite fun, but that was also important for them to see firsthand the implications of their actions and policies in relation to women's needs in the built environment. It was a very visible project. There was a lot of media interest, both in the local media, but also national news, which was important to me and to us all, because we just didn't want to be seen as if that we're discussing gender issues back in the office, as if it's some kind of a technical issue. It is a very live issues out there, and there are a lot of women actually have the same concerns. We followed up these events with, again, working with local groups to set up, develop checklists, design guidelines, developing a grant scheme for shop owners to improve their accessibility. There was a competition for best and the least accessible shops in the borough. So we were also looking at policy tweaks, again, as design guidelines and checklists for planners to follow through when they were looking at planning applications, for instance. So yes, a lot of activity and a lot of enthusiasm, and I think it was quite a successful project in many aspects. That was 20 years ago. And looking back.
Thank you, Sile. That's been a really interesting insight, and hopefully we'll see more of those sorts of projects, going forward. Even though it was done a while ago, it doesn't mean it isn't relevant now. Marion, in terms of reclaiming spaces from an urban design, urban planning point of view, from your sort of research and projects, how do you sort of integrate, including people from using the sort of the gender lens on that?
I think I'd like to sort of move away from characterizing women as always looking after young children and babies, and mention more younger women going out at night, which is one of the more positive features of the expansion of the nighttime economy, which we've been experiencing, I think, not only in the UK, but across Europe for the last 2 decades. And the importance of catering for mobility at night. And this isn't just about consumption. Women, sorry, I'm using an academic term. It's not about women going out, enjoying themselves, because more women have disposable income and can go out and eat and, drink and dance and so on, which is great. But it's also about women workers at night who might be working in bars or who might actually be doing care work at night. And that was one of the significant findings of the nighttime study done by the GLA Economics, where they found, I can't remember the exact percentages now, but a significant number of nighttime workers are women. So again, it's raising these issues that Inés talked about safety, about the importance of public transport, about having an accessible public transport that runs at night as well. And of course, this has been important in the pandemic for all the nurses and the doctors and the social care workers who have to work at night. So I think this is a really important feature for planners to think about, that we don't just exist in the daytime hours, but there's a gendered impact throughout the whole 24-hour cycle of urban areas. You know, I think another piece of research I'd like to highlight comes from Spain again, from Barcelona, and a wonderful woman called Sarah Ortiz Escalante did her PhD on women workers, which included prostitutes, in fact, sex workers at night in Barcelona. And she found how there were barriers to them moving around the city, even to just getting from one side of a busy road to another in a hospital. And her work was taken on board by the regional planning authority in Barcelona, which, you know, is terrific. It sort of shows the impact that these kind of studies can make.
Thank you, Marion. I'm conscious of time and I'm keen to hear from the rest of our participants. Can I hand over to Kova and Rose to pick out a couple of questions which we can get the panelists to look at?
Yes, I think Coco is going to pick up on the first question.
Hi. Well, the first question is something I thought was going to come up at some point. What are the implications of gender mainstreaming for people to whom the traditional binary idea of gender does not apply? Is this taken into account in current gender mainstreaming guidance? This goes to anyone, sorry.
Should I respond? I can give a first response. According to the UN descriptions and the Treaty of Amsterdam descriptions, gender, their definitions apply to equality between men and women. That's the main concern of the standing legislation and the concept of gender mainstreaming. Also, in our case in Spain, our legislation that applies to planning is looking at gender differences between women and men. This doesn't mean that there are not implications for non-binary persons, but first, it doesn't have the same kind of legal recognition, and then there is not the same level of academic or research or understanding of what these differences and implications for actual planning can be. So I would say this is something that is on the road, but it's not yet quite yet there, neither on research or on policy.
If I could jump in, obviously this is a very hot topic in the UK, and but in our Equalities Act, gender reassignment and sexual orientation is part of that. And so it has to be taken on, you know, it's a requirement legislatively in Britain. And certainly there are, you know, we are moving towards the provision of gender neutral toilets, for example, in public spaces. And also there has been a significant move possibly rather exploitatively, to encourage, if there was a move kind of in terms of regeneration, looking at the pink pound and encouraging gay quarters, gay villages, in Manchester, in Brighton and so on. I think there's been less attention to the need of lesbian women particularly, and I found that in my teaching practice, that it was much harder for especially younger lesbian women to have spaces where they could feel safe and where they could meet. So it is an area of planning practice that needs further research and further investigation. There's a book by Petra Doan called Querying Planning, which planners may want to refer to. And she's an American author. So I think this is, as Inés says, an ongoing area of research and practice that planners, we need to engage with.
Sorry, Zoe, if I could just come in on the equalities impact assessment point. We did some research, which I won't go into all of the details of, but looking at the London boroughs local plans, and actually looked at equalities impact assessment as part of that project. I think one of the concerns is that just because of lack of probably experience, sometimes they're pretty much a tick box exercise rather than a really meaningful part of the process. And so on the back of that research, we did make recommendations to government, which haven't been picked up to date, but we'll continue to try and push them around saying that government should publish more planning policy guidance or planning practice guidance around how to do a really high quality equalities impact assessment, and are calling on local authorities to say you need to really embed this from the beginning of the plan making process, rather than sort of making your plan and then just ticking through to say, oh, it looks okay or not. So I think, as you say, Marion, they do exist, but I think at the moment they're a sort of area that could really be improved to make them more meaningful.
Thank you, Fiona. And just on that, around sort of issues in health and well-being, with the Healthy Homes Act that I know the TCPA are championing at the moment, what do you think will push the needle forward on inclusive planning?
Well, I was listening to Inés's presentation and was very envious, I have to say, of the standards that you mentioned that have been adopted in the Basque region, because that's essentially what we're talking about, not solely for gender reasons, but actually, as you say, Zoe, making that link to health and well-being and the quality of people's homes, and what that profound link is for those people. And I think the COVID pandemic has brought that home for a lot of people. So for those people that don't know about the Healthy Homes Act, it's arguing for national legislation that would set minimum standards on a range of areas. Some of them are house specific, so relate to space, access to light. Some are about the environment in which those homes are, so very much recognising some of the points that we've talked about around safety, accessibility, and we do talk about trying to make sure that homes are sort of future-proof, both for climate and accessibility and adaptability, so trying to pick up some of those points. We believe it would help in terms of moving inclusivity forward. It would very much be a minimum standard. So of course, some homes that we hope would far exceed them, but we also see it very much as a social justice issue, because we recognise that some of the people living in the worst quality homes are, of course, are most disadvantaged. And so we want to raise the bar for them and try and help them make sure that the homes that they're living in are of good enough standard. I think the challenge is, as we've talked about today, it goes far beyond just homes. So I think it would be a start, but very much recognise it's not the only part of a much bigger solution that's needed. So, of course, trying to retrofit existing places, like you touched on earlier, both for homes and the built environment, trying to make places more walkable. It's a big agenda. So the Healthy Homes Act, I think, would really help a specific part, but there'll be still a huge amount more to do, and we recognise that.
Thank you. Rose and Coco, do we have any other questions from the floor?
Yes, we have a kind of two-part question here. It's been asked, what sort of gender data should planners or anybody be looking for, aiming to either collect it or generate? And then the sort of second part to it is, how can we make it more common for developers and designers to use data and to think about health and gender in proposals? Should there be requirements in design and access statements to address these issues?
I can provide an answer to the second one. What we have seen in Spain is that there have been like 2 points of change, I would say, since we started doing some research on this over 20 years ago, and doing some activism and so on. There was a first point of change when legislation started to be approved. And this has been a process because we are a decentralized state, and planning is, as I said, a regional competence. So regions are the ones who legislate on planning. And some have started different. It has taken like a whole bunch of almost 15 years since we have now a quite significant body of legislation. And this legislation was not used at all for many, many years. It was there, but nobody cared. Until 3 years ago, there was a judiciary decision by the Supreme Court, by the Superior Court of Madrid and the Superior Court of Andalusia, that cancelled several plans because they didn't have a gender impact assessment. And so when a plan is cancelled, that's a very serious thing, because plans are very difficult things to do. They take a long time. They are very labor intensive. They are money intensive. I mean, they are like a kind of difficult thing. So big thing. And then suddenly gender has become a topic of incredible professional and institutional interest. There was a second factor into that. The first one was this: first, having the legislation, which is legally binding in Spain, and then second, having the judiciary decisions cancelling plans because of not applying properly the legislation. And then that happened 3 years ago together with the Me Too movement and some cases of rape in Spain that had a very big impact on public opinion. So the two things happened at the same year, and so they combined for a big change in public opinion regarding feminism and regarding gender equality policies, in such a way that now nobody would dare to say I'm not for gender equality policies. Almost nobody now dares to say I'm not a feminist. I mean, this is a bit of a joke, but there's some truth to it. So, and this change in public opinion, together with the sentences from the courts, are the ones that have changed the approach. And now it's a serious and a topic of attention from professionals and from the institutions. And I'm seeing a substantive change. Let's see how it evolves in time. But I see that it's a moment of change right now, and those are the main triggers to it.
Yes, Marion, do you want to go next?
I think one of the areas of data that, well, we miss generally throughout the built environment study in terms of studies is actually post-evaluation. Once a development scheme or a housing scheme has actually happened. And I think that's one of the problems with us making gender impact assessments, because we don't know for sure what the impact of, I mean, obviously impacts are always difficult to measure. In my university, they tried to do a before and after study for the Jubilee extension line, and, what happens before, and developers anticipate, and then what happens after, and all, because projects take a long time, you don't have a clear, it's not like health or, where you can do these controlled experiments. But we're very bad about doing evaluations. And I think that is something that we really, really need to do, even if, the data is imperfect, even if we can't really work out, what the impact of something specifically is. If you can do a certain number, you can at least start making some generalizations. So we have, I mean, I think Fiona pointed out, we have these sort of little bits of data, but it's actually paying people to put them together to make sense of them. And also, you know, or like the way Inés did with the mobility of care concept, to say, well, you know, let's look at the data in a different way and really take our time to do it. So I think there's a big scoping study to be done on what sources of data exist, then a gendered, you know, lens that really says, what does the data mean? How should we examine it? What critical approaches can we take to it? And then actually commissioning or making sure that data is really collected properly. For example, with nighttime economy data, we've discovered that there are only tiny, tiny amounts of data actually collected nationally within our, and also within the employment categories, the sick employment categories, you know, so there are lots of gaps that need filling, and we need to, you know, national, regional, really, you know, those kind of level of bodies to be looking very critically at this issue.
Zile, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I want to emphasize the word visibility again, because mainstreaming on its own is nothing unless there is good data, visible, we know what it is. And there is also, for instance, training to go with it for planners on how to analyze, how to understand, and how to make use of it. I mean, in local authorities, we have, of course, equality impact assessments. And when you look at them, there is some analysis on it, but you can, there is not enough information where the data is coming from. So you can second guess and say, I think they are talking about gender issues here, and the, you know, the analysis of some kind of a gender issue here, but it's not really clear. So that needs to be much more visible. Like Marian said, we need to, and Fiona said, you know, pull together different data and make it visible. And the second thing is we don't monitor the outcomes. And I was just before Marian spoke, I was thinking about, for instance, you know, wearing my local plan hat, if you like, annual monitoring reports that we produce, and or similar type of assessments in relation to planning policies. What are the implications of those policies that we generate? And then, you know, especially from a gender point of view, and how do we measure it? Do we ask the local community? Is that, you know, is our cities are safer and, you know, better cater for their needs? Or do we look at data and see if there is any change? Of course, you know, the type of issues we're talking about, we're not going to be able to make change from one year to another. But if we can get into some kind of a habit of assessing the impact and monitoring the outcomes, then that would be a good way of having that visibility. I fear in relation to mainstream, and I think that's also happened in 1990s in relation to this Open Sesame project. There were lots of activity in early 1990s, and then towards the end of it, there was this trend towards mainstreaming, pulling all equality strands together, moving perhaps people with the skills and training and knowledge towards the center of local authorities, moving them away from the services. So it sort of became more like a tick box exercise, a paper exercise. And you know, I think rather than mainstreamed, gender issues gotten lost. That's how I feel. And that's why I think the word visibility when it comes to gender and town planning is very important. We need to look at the whole process of town planning, how we make local plans, how we decide on planning applications, and see at which points that we need to make gender issues visible for at the end of the day, for us to be able to say, yes, you know, we're achieving something, we're getting somewhere.
I would echo, sorry if it's all right, Zoe, just quickly, I would echo the point around looking at the system holistically, something that we've been trying to ask government to consider as part of the reform agenda is actually being far more explicit about the purpose of the planning system as a whole, and being explicit that it is about delivering sustainable development and thinking about improving the health and well-being of people. And so it's not gender specific necessarily, but shifting that emphasis and being really clear for communities, developers, planners, that actually what they should be thinking about, both in terms of plan making and decision taking, is, will this improve, people's lives? And of course, yes, that includes economic, but it's not economic growth for the sake of it. It's about what impact that will have on people. Similarly, for house building, yes, we need more houses, but they need to be the right type, tenure, in the right location. It's not just a numbers game. So is this development going to help people thrive? And trying to rebalance the system so that that's what we're thinking about when we use it, rather than, I think certainly with the sort of ongoing reform agenda at times, it can just feel like we fixate on the process without really thinking about what we're trying to achieve with it. And I do think that would help with, trying to make sure planners are thinking about the health of the people that will be affected by these plans.
Thanks, Fiona. Can we have another question? I'm conscious we've probably only got time for maybe one or two.
Okay, we have one more from Karen Harwood. How do you influence the policymakers so they see gender mainstreaming as a priority? Is it down to interested individuals or more a formal driver?
Fiona, do you want to take that in terms of the policy and influencing government?
Absolutely. And as you'll have gathered, we have lots of thoughts and they don't necessarily listen to them. So I don't know if I can help answer that one. But I think, I had a quick look at the National Planning Policy Framework before we were talking, and obviously hearing about how mainstreamed in the guidance, regional level, at local level and national, is really fascinating for Spain. So I think, the good news, I think, is that National Planning Policy Framework does reply to inclusive, I think, twice, and it does say that planning policies and decisions should aim to achieve healthy, inclusive and safe spaces. They don't, I think, talk about equality, diversity or gender. So there's lots that needs to be done, I think, but there is a hook, and I think that is what's important, that actually local authorities can use that as a hook if they want to take forward some of the points that we've talked about today in their local plans. So I think from a government point of view, it is hard to influence at the moment. We've got the planning white paper and reform agenda, so there are opportunities, but we do have a government at the moment, of course, who is into deregulation, is looking to expand permitted development rights, which actually I would argue would exacerbate many of the challenges we've talked about today, because actually they won't have to consider planning policy and whether or not those go ahead. Community views won't be heard. So actually we're in quite a challenging time in terms of influencing, but that's not to say we mustn't keep trying. So I think there's thinking about how can actually we achieve quite a lot at the local level with the hooks that we've got, almost despite some of the things that are happening at the national level. And again, neighbourhood plans, we do have all of these different tiers, but it is resource intensive, and we know that our planners are under pressure in local authorities as well. So sorry, that's not a very helpful answer. I think it is a challenging time to try and get some of this into the national MPPF and legislation, if I'm perfectly honest.
Absolutely. Sile, also if you can reflect on some of the work in women in planning as well, around how that may help in this space, that would be quite helpful.
Just before that, sorry, because I think the resources issue is very important. I feel really lucky that we had the resources and time and space to run a project like Open Sesame 20 years ago. I just can't imagine in local planning policy teams are doing a similar project with the resources and the pressures that they have at the moment. But that's important because, I don't know if we still do that. Apologies if we don't. But we used to talk about women, Black and ethnic minority groups, etc. It's hard to reach groups 20 years ago. We were always desperately trying to find ways of, how we can open the communication channels, etc. And to me, now thinking back, is that there are no hard to reach groups. It's just that you need to have the resources, the methodology and the patience, etc., to be able to work with those communities. When that happens, then it works. In the Open Sesame project, sorry, I keep coming back to that, but in that project, the most support, the ardent supporters of the project were women from the deprived communities. They were the ones sort of, going out and doing the surveys in town centers, etc. So it actually worked, but it worked simply because we almost spent like a year doing the groundwork and, continued to engage them for more than 2 years. And it's all about resources. If we, while making a local plan, if you just send them a questionnaire and a survey and just told them, can you just identify what type of issues? I don't think they would have been that much interested and, enthusiastic about the Open Sesame project as they did then. So I think resources is a major issue if we really think about not just collecting data, pulling things together. You need people for this, in our offices, but you also need people who will be out there working with local communities on a day-to-day basis to also collect information from them to shape our policies. In terms of women and in planning, sorry, just the question. Again, in early 1990s, we had a London Women and Planning Forum. It was an informal forum. Of course, Haringey was not the only local authority working on women's issues then, or gender issues then. There were other local authorities in London. And after the GLC is abolished, we felt that we needed to get together to share ideas, problems, issues, etc. And it was quite a wide range of participants in it too, from architects to academics. We were lucky to also have the women's design services. Marion will know that. They were there to, if you like, do the administration, help with organizing the meetings, but more importantly also to publish our discussions like broadsheet. So I still have some of those broadsheets, and looking back, again, 20 years ago, we were talking about roughly the same type of issues that we're talking today. It's a bit, discouraging, but nevertheless, I think, these are different times and these are different issues. We just have to keep working on them. And the Women in Planning group, obviously, in the last 2 years or so, they've been doing a great job of, putting gender issues on the planners' agenda, quite high than it was before.
Great, thank you. And for my sort of final question and observation would be sort of revisiting that hashtag around, what the whole theme of this year's International Women's Day is, which is choose to challenge. And I think from our sort of really in-depth and lively discussion this afternoon, I would reflect on my personal, what I'm going to choose to challenge will definitely be on the data side of things. I think being more aware that there's going to be gender bias in some of the data. It might not be purposeful, but actually digging a bit under the skin and investigating that is something which I think I would take away from this sort of discussion today. So thank you very much for making me think a bit more about that. I'd like to ask each of you what your sort of choose to challenge, whether it's based on this discussion, whether it's more personal or work life more broadly. What will you sort of choose to challenge this sort of year, or in the coming months? Inés, can you start?
I'm not totally sure what choose to challenge means. I'm sorry. I think it's a language issue only. I don't know exactly what you mean by choose to challenge. Sorry.
So this is the campaign for this year is really looking out for calling out biases, gender biases. So things like if in the movie industry, for example, where there may be less representation of women in leading roles, that kind of thing. How will you sort of help to call out gender bias and make sure we can live in a more inclusive world? Or would someone else like to go next?
Yes, please.
Fine.
Someone.
From my point of view, I think it would that point that we mentioned around government sort of deregulation agenda. So I think myself and the TCPA more generally will continue to try and challenge the government about trying to say, got to stop deregulating. If we want a planning system that can tackle some of these issues that we've talked about today, rather than exacerbating inequality, then we need to be able to have the tools to do it. And part of that is a strong planning system, not a deregulated one that just enables change outside of the planning system. So we'll keep plugging away at that and try and challenge that.
Thank you. Marion, any sort of challenges?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, if change really is going to be embedded, it's got to start, unfortunately, in Britain from the top. It's actually got to go into the NPPF for it to actually make a difference. And I'd echo Fiona's point of view that, but perhaps more politically, saying that economic growth has to be about, well, I'd challenge the idea of economic growth, really, about the idea of measuring GDP in pounds, shilling and pence, and support anybody who talks about valuing unpaid work, about care, about the low paid work that women do. And therefore, you know, planning is very technical. And the way to get through is to make sure, sorry, that gender is actually mentioned as a word in the NPPF. I think that's the only way things are really, really going to change.
Thank you. And Sule?
Yeah, I like Marion, I challenge the at the national level and local level, all those in government, to mention the gender word in, you know, mainly for planners in our case. And I also challenge the central government to give more resources to local authorities so that they can make things happen. That's one of the main blocking issues, stopping planners perhaps thinking more innovatively, you know, looking at things in much more detail and coming up with solutions. I'm sure, you know, planners are capable of doing that. It's just the resources are actually holding them back.
Thank you. And Inés, anything you'd like to challenge?
Well, because I am not, I would have to think about Spain maybe. I think that we have a challenge to educate people, to educate professionals, and on the one side, it's a key thing that we have experienced is that getting things into legislation and support from the top is absolutely necessary for anything to happen in public policy. So, and in our experience, there was a big change when that has started to happen, upheld by the courts. And now in the places where this is starting to be implemented is where there are high-ranking politicians and officials who are caring. And this is starting to happen not only among women, also men are starting to support this from high political positions in regional governments and in local governments. So support from the top is one key thing, and I would say that second key thing is the education of our professionals at universities and long life training programs among professional staff in city halls, in different planning departments across the different local authorities and regional authorities.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for your participation this afternoon. Inés, thank you very much for your really in-depth presentation and so many practical examples. We're really lucky to have you here today. And also to our fantastic panel, Fiona, Marion and Sule, thank you very much for giving your thoughts and sort of bringing us up to speed with what's happening and some of those really groundbreaking projects. I would like to also thank Women in Planning for hosting this and also TCPA for supporting this, as well as Coco and Rose for helping us on the Q&A angle and everyone else who's helped to make this event happen today. I hope everyone has a fantastic International Women's Day and you're engaging in other events as we draw to the kind of finale, and do make sure you interact with Choose to Challenge, and we look forward to seeing you at future Women in Planning events. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.